All right, everybody. Good evening. Welcome. Thank you all for being here. My name is Tucker. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm an educator here at Wenatchee River Institute. Thank you for being here for our keynote address and for being here for part of Leavenworth Spring Bird Fest. It's been a lot of planning and organizing and a lot of fun seeing it actually happen this weekend. So yeah, thank you all for being here. First and foremost, I want to introduce a couple people that are helping out tonight. Keynote is our executive director who's checking you in out there. And yeah, welcome Keynote. You'll hear from him shortly here. We also have Jeremy in the back over there, who's one of our amazing volunteers, who's going to be, yeah, give it up for Jeremy. Thank you, Jeremy. He's making it possible for those of you at home who are streaming this live here. And we also have Jackie in the back from A Book for All Seasons. And she is selling our speaker's book tonight, as well as our speaker from last year's book. So she'll be around at the end of the talk if you'd like to purchase either of those. So just a quick question, a show of hands. Is this anybody's first time participating in an event at Wenatchee River Institute? Cool. Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, thank you all for being here and welcome. So Wenatchee River Institute, just a quick little background. We're a nonprofit with a mission to connect people, communities, and the natural world. And we do that through kind of two branches of education, our youth programs and our community programs. Our youth programs connect with schools all over the region. They come up here to our campus for field trips, and we travel all around to their classrooms to deliver lessons in their class. Our community programs are pretty varied. We do seasonal walks. We host workshops with other instructors. We have speaker events in here in the Red Barn, and Bird Fest, of course, which is our biggest event of the year. And that's a big part of what we do, is connecting you all to the natural world and to each other, too. So just a quick note, if you are still looking for more stuff to do for Birdfest, there's, I think, 3 trips that have a spot open for tomorrow. So get on it if you want to do any more trips tomorrow. So another thing for our programs here at WRI, we do value having the privilege of having a voice in our community, and we think it's really important to use that. And we like to begin all of our programs by recognizing the people that were on this land first and taking the time to read a land acknowledgement. So I'm going to go ahead and read this land acknowledgement for you all here. This land acknowledgement was created alongside the Shimpishquashu people. We're spreading the message they wish to be spread to the public. The land Wenatchee River Institute sits on is the ancestral homelands of the Shimpishquashu, Pisquosa, or Wenatchee people. The Shimpishquashu, meaning people in between, had villages positioned along the Wenatchee River and surrounding areas. Their ancestral homeland extends from the Cascade Ridge throughout what is now known as the Wenatchee and Okanagan valleys. The culture and economy of the Shimpishquashu people centers on taking care of the land. They fish, hunt, gather roots and berries, basket-making materials, and medicines. The Shimpishquashu are named within the Yakima Treaty of 1855. Language to establish the Wenatchee Reservation was never followed through, even with the needed surveying completed. Many Shimpishquashu now live on the Colville Reservation, 150 miles northeast of here. They were forced off their land, and the U.S. government moved them to this reservation. The Shimpishquashu people are still alive today. They continue to practice their culture, harvest their traditional foods and medicines, and hold their ceremonies passed down from their ancestors. Most people won't see or notice them, but they continue to be on the land they're connected to. Their traditional language is Inhamchin, an interior Salish dialect, and I'd like to welcome you all by saying hello in their language, Tilhusht. We offer this land acknowledgement as the first step to amplifying indigenous voices and recognizing the harm done to them as a people. We stand as an ally to recognize their connection to the land and their rights to practice their culture on these sacred lands. We encourage all to learn about the indigenous peoples of the place you call home. Wenatchee River Institute is committed to sharing this land acknowledgement and following up with other actions to educate and be respectful. So thank you, everybody. Okay. Another note here, I would like to take a moment to thank all of our wonderful sponsors. We couldn't do BirdFest without these organizations and businesses. So I will, actually, I do want to give a quick special shout out to North Central Washington Audubon Society. Put your hands together for them, please. They are our biggest sponsor out of all these organizations you see up here, and they are our partners in putting on this event. So big thank you to them, and thank you to all the people, volunteers from Audubon who have helped make this happen, as well as sponsoring as well. So other sponsors I'd like to shout out are Sleeping Lady Mountain Resort, Ludwig's German Restaurant, Leavenworth KOA, Icicle Brewing Company, Obertal Inn, South Restaurants, München House, Gustav's, Hotel Pension Anna, Leavenworth Chamber of Commerce, Syndicate Smith, Rhine House, Leavenworth Outdoor Center, Winton Manufacturing, Blue Elk Inn, the Nature Conservancy, Wild Birds Unlimited, Leavenworth Coffee Roasters, and Leavenworth Village Inn. So if you're out and around town, please go support these businesses. They support us. So let's thank those sponsors again one more time. Thank you. Okay, before we get into our keynote address, I want to bring Keynote up here to announce our 2024 Founders Award recipient. So Keynote, come on up.
Thank you, Tucker. My name is Keynote Taranella. I'm the director of the Wenatchee River Institute, and I'm so happy you all are here. I get the honor and privilege of introducing the Founders Award winners this year. The Founders Award was an idea of a local volunteer, and the award was created in 2022. The Founders Award was created to honor the volunteerism and support that those volunteers show for Leavenworth's Spring Bird Fest. The award was inspired by the group of volunteers who came together in 2003 to do the very first Leavenworth Spring Bird Fest. There are two categories for nominations: individual volunteer and professional. And it's my pleasure to share the announcement of this year's award winners with the folks who are on the committee to decide who is going to be a winner. Karen Hare, will you come up and start us off?
Hi, I'm Karen Hare, and I was here at the very first Spring Bird Fest, and we were planning everything, didn't know what we were doing because we were inventing the wheel. And this rafting owner came up to us and said, hey, my guides really like seeing the birds. Our customers are asking about the birds. How about doing a family float on the gentle waters of the Icicle and have that be a birding trip? And we said, sure. And so Gary Flanagan did that.
There he is.
And he's done it. He's done it every single year since then. And so Gary's the Founders Award winner for the professional category with his company Osprey Rafting, which has a fabulous name. And if you get a chance to do that, maybe next year, if you don't have a chance this year, it's a wonderful, wonderful special field trip. Come on up, Gary.
Thanks, Gary. Thank you. Will you hold on until we get a photo here? Yeah. Nancy Warner, will you come up and make Gary stand up a little longer?
You guys Let's take a photo.
just for the photo.
Oh, my wife is.
You got me, good. Okay. Oh,
Okay.
I got it. You got it, great.
Good job.
My name's Nancy Warner, and I'm here at the invitation of Beth St. George, who could not be here to accept the Founders Award for she and her husband, David St. George. So David passed away 2 years ago, so it's poignant to be here thinking about him and how much he loved birds and helped other people love birds. And with Beth by his side, they introduced lots of people to the joys of birding, to, in some cases, you'll see some pictures up here actually holding a bird and having a chance to hear a bird's heartbeat and see it up close and just the joy, the discovery. And you know that. I mean, you know that. They loved connecting people with birds, Beth and David both. And so here's Beth joined with helping a couple of kids here at the Bird Fest discover that joy. So I have a couple things, I'll just read this. They met at Evergreen State College. And those of you who are from Washington know what a cool place that was when it first started. They were there. So they met in an ornithology class. And they lived their whole lives together exploring the natural world and celebrating life. So we were lucky to have them here in the area where they helped with Christmas bird counts, they helped with Bird Fest, they helped do a lot of research, bird banding. So I'm just thrilled to be here accepting this award for these dear people that though some people knew locally, but if you didn't, their spirit is with us. So.
Thank you. I'll leave it back to you.
Okay, thank you. All right. Well, without further ado, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker for tonight. Rebecca Heisman is an award-winning science writer who lives in Walla Walla and has worked with organizations including the Audubon Society, American Bird Conservancy, the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and the American Ornithological Society. And Flight Paths is her first book. So please welcome Rebecca Heisman.
I was joking, can everyone hear me okay in the back? There's no microphone except the one for Zoom, so I'll try to be loud. I was joking earlier today that the last slide of my PowerPoint has my website, RebeccaHeisman.com, that I should add the website that I bought this skirt from, because that's the #1 question all day is, where'd you get that skirt? Leslie Evers is the name. So thank you so much for having me here. I'm really delighted to be here this evening. And I was invited to come up and give a talk for you all because I am the author of a book that came out a little over a year now. A year ago now. I can't believe that it's been that long, about how we know what we know about bird migration. So I spent several years of my life immersed in this topic. I read more scientific papers than I could possibly count. I talked to dozens of scientists, a lot of ornithologists, of course, but also a surprising number of computer scientists and engineers, things like that. We'll meet one of those engineers later in this talk. I got to join a few of those ornithologists in the field, to be there in person while they were carrying out their work. And it's just been a huge privilege to get to tell the stories of some of the scientists who are featured in this talk and in my book. I'm not a scientist, I'm a science writer. And I feel like they're the real experts, and I'm just here trying to bring the things that they're doing to a wider audience and to tell their stories. And it's a really fun job to have because there are so many good stories to tell about bird migration. So these are just a few of the amazing migrators whose stories appear in my book, and some of these birds might be familiar. On the lower left, that's the bar-tailed godwit. These are the birds that make what, as far as I know, is the longest known nonstop migratory flight. Every fall, these guys start out in Alaska, and they fly across the Pacific Ocean without stopping and don't touch down until they get to New Zealand in that region. Yes. In the middle, that's the bar-headed goose. That one might be less familiar because these birds are from Asia. They fly back and forth over the Himalayan mountains every year as they migrate back and forth in Asia. And on the upper right, that's a blackpoll warbler. These little guys, to get from New England to their wintering grounds in northern South America, they launch themselves out and they spend 3 days flying over the open water of the Western Atlantic, which sounds less impressive than the godwit crossing the Pacific, except a godwit is like the size of a football, and a blackpoll warbler weighs about the same as a ballpoint pen. So it's astonishing. But for me, what fascinates me just as much as what migrating birds do and how they do it is how we even figured out that all of this was happening. And so that's what my book and my talk are about, and that's what I'm here to talk about tonight. So I want to give just a tiny bit more background about me and how my book came to exist before I really dive in. So before COVID, I was working full-time remotely from Walla Walla for the American Ornithological Society, AOS. This is the big professional society for scientists who study birds. So they put on a research conference every year, they give out research grants, and they also publish 2 peer-reviewed scientific journals. Those are what you see here. So these are where scientists publish, their reports on their new discoveries. I was their one-person communications department, so I wore a lot of hats. But a lot of what I did was promoting the new research that was being published in these journals to science journalists and to the public. And so I was reading a lot of scientific papers and trying to figure out how to, turn them into fun press releases and stuff. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the structure of a scientific paper, but they all follow the same basic format. They start with the introduction, where the researchers explain kind of the backstory of their project and what question they're trying to answer and why it's worth studying. And then there's the methods, where they go step by step through the procedure that they followed to carry out their study. And then there's the results and discussion, where they talk about what they found, why it matters, and where we might go next. So I was reading all of these papers, and I kept getting sucked into and fascinated by the part that I think a lot of people skim over to get to the good stuff, which is the methods, how they did all these projects. I did not know, or if I had learned in my undergraduate ornithology class, I had forgotten, that you can study bird migration using weather radar. You can study it by putting out microphones at night to passively record the calls of night migrating birds. You can study bird migration by analyzing rare hydrogen isotopes in bird feathers. I'm not going to get into that this evening, but there's a chapter about it in the book, and it's wild. So I started thinking, how does all of this work? Like, what is the science behind this, and who figured out that this was possible? Like, who got the idea that you could study migration by analyzing hydrogen isotopes? Who would even think of that? And so I was just wondering about where all of these methods came from and how they worked and who came up with them. And when COVID happened, I ended up leaving that job. I was one of the millions of people who, quit their job because they suddenly didn't have any childcare. A few of you saw my kid running around earlier. And so I quit that job, and I decided to write a book proposal based on that idea. Like, what's the history and science behind all of these methods? And so that turned into the book that came out last year. So I cover a lot of ground in the book. This is the table of contents. And basically what I did was I just went chapter by chapter through each of the major techniques that have been developed over time to figure out what's going on with these long-distance migrations. So beginning with the origins of scientific bird banding way back in the early days of the 20th century, and going all the way up through the latest high-tech advances like miniaturized satellite transmitters and high-volume genomic sequencing, that sort of thing. If we had more time, we could play a guessing game of which chapter title goes with which technique. But so when I thought about how I wanted to turn this into a 45-minute book talk, I cannot fit all of this into a 45-minute talk. We'd be here for 3 hours, more than that. So I decided that the most fun thing to do would be to just zoom in on 3 of my favorite stories from the book. And so that's what I'm going to do this evening. I'm going to share the stories of 3 of my favorite migration innovators who I learned about while doing all of this research, and wrap up a little bit by talking about why this sort of thing matters for bird conservation. And my hope is that you'll come away from this talk with a new sense of appreciation of all of the creativity and hard work that went into every little gee whiz factoid that you ever hear about bird migration, that went into figuring that out. So the first tactic for figuring out what migratory birds are doing that I want to talk about is one that I had not even heard of before I started researching this book, because it's not used very much anymore. And this is called moon watching. So most of these long-distance migrants, they migrate at night, and there's some reasons for that. The air is calmer, et cetera. But that means that if you want to see what they're doing, like, not only are they flying pretty high up, it's also dark outside. So you can't really just observe them directly. You have to get creative. And today we have all of these tools like radar, which I'm going to talk about, and satellite transmitters and stuff to see what's going on with these nighttime migrants. But before any of that technology was developed, this guy, whose name was George Lowry, came up with a really clever way to do this using just a telescope. So George Lowry was born in Louisiana in 1913. He was obsessed with birds from a very young age, avid birder from the time that he was a child. He finished his master's degree from the University of Louisiana at Baton Rouge in 1936, and he stayed on there for the rest of his career as an instructor and an ornithologist, and he founded their Museum of Zoology, which is still going strong today. And living along the coast of Louisiana and being really, really into birds, George Lowry would have been familiar with the phenomenon of migratory fallout. So some of you have heard of this, I'm sure. This is when, in spring, birds migrating north out of South America, often they fly across the Gulf of Mexico to get to North America. And depending on the weather conditions, sometimes they just fall out of the sky en masse at the first bit of land that they get to. So like the first grove of trees behind the beach will just be full of this incredible concentration of every sort of migratory songbird just dripping out of the trees. And there wasn't really a way to prove it at the time, but in the early 20th century, a lot of ornithologists, including George Lowry, thought, based on circumstantial evidence like seeing migratory fallout, that it was likely that birds migrating north flew over the open water of the Gulf of Mexico on a regular basis, that this was probably a normal part of the annual cycle of these migratory birds. But then in the 1940s, another biologist named George Williams, Second George, it was a popular name for mid-century ornithologists, so bear with me. We had George Lowry, and now we have George Williams, who comes along and says, hang on, this makes no sense. Why would these birds voluntarily choose to fly over hundreds of miles of open water when Mexico is right there? Basically, he was like, guys, I know we don't see these birds in Mexico, but it's the only thing that makes sense. They must be going this way. We're just not looking hard enough. Now, George Lowry, George number 1, who, again, had seen the circumstantial evidence of migration across the Gulf with his own eyes, was really annoyed by this and really wanted to come up with a way to prove George Williams, George number 2, wrong. They had a really intense like back and forth in the scientific journals of the day, like rebuttals of rebuttals of rebuttals. And so George Lowry started casting around for a way that he might prove that large-scale trans-Gulf migration was a real phenomenon. And he remembered some like quirky papers from the very beginnings of the 20th century that he'd read, where folks had reported looking at the full moon through a telescope during migration season and being able to see the silhouettes of these night migrating birds passing in front of the bright disk of the full moon. And he thought, that's interesting. I bet I could do something with that. Now, luckily for Lowry, there was an astronomy professor also at LSU at this time who was a bird watcher. And so Lowry and this astronomer, they put their heads together, and they came up with a set of equations that would let Lowry take a raw count of how many birds he could see passing in front of the moon in a certain amount of time, and do some math, and turn this into an estimate of how many birds must be passing over an imaginary 1-mile line on the Earth's surface at that location every hour. This sounds pretty abstract, but what this meant was that Lowry now had a tool to compare how much migration was happening at one place in time with how much migration was happening at another place in time. Sounds pretty basic, but there hadn't really been a good way of measuring that before. And so Lowry called this the migration traffic rate, and he thought that with this, yeah, good name, he finally had a tool to prove George number 2 wrong. So April 1945, George Lowry packs up a telescope, and he boards a ship that's heading across the Gulf of Mexico for the Yucatan. He's like, all right, I'm gonna do it, I'm so excited. The first night he goes up on deck, so excited to prove George number 2 wrong. He sets up his telescope on the deck of the boat, he points it up at the moon, he looks in the eyepiece. George Lowry did not have any experience at sea. You see where this is going. He had failed to anticipate the fact that when he looked in the eyepiece, the moon would be bobbing up and down, in and out of sight with the waves. It was impossible to get an accurate count. But George Lowry was not a man who gave up easily, so he was undeterred. He waited until they got to the Yucatan and they docked where the water was calmer, and he pointed his telescope out at the full moon rising over the Gulf, and in 45 minutes, he counted 12 birds. That might not sound like a lot, but when he did the math, this worked out to more than 3,700 birds passing over a 1-mile line extending out into the Gulf at that location every hour. So today, I think we kind of take this phenomenon of birds flying across the Gulf for granted, but George Lowry had just collected the first hard numerical evidence that large-scale trans-Gulf migration was real. Take that, George number 2. So Lowry knew he was onto something with this. He was just getting started. His next idea was to scale this up and recruit volunteers from all over North America to collect this kind of data. But this was going to be a huge project. There was no way he was going to be able to manage this alone. Luckily for Lowry, an enthusiastic young grad student named Bob Newman arrived at LSU right around this time. So this is Lowry again on the left and Newman on the right. This is obviously not Bob Newman as an enthusiastic young grad student. In the pre-smartphone era, there weren't a lot of photos published of people until they got famous. So I couldn't find any photos of young Bob Newman. Use your imagination. So like Lowry, Newman arrived at LSU as a grad student and ended up staying on for the rest of his career. Both of these men passed away decades ago, so I didn't get to interview either of them while working on my book, but I did get to talk to an ornithologist now in his 80s who studied under them when he was a grad student. He shared a lot of his memories of the two of them. It sounds like in a lot of ways, these two guys could not have been more different. They were sort of the odd couple of ornithology. Lowry was an old school gentleman naturalist who wore a suit and tie for field work. I think he would have been right at home in like the 19th century. He organized expeditions into the jungle to gather new specimens for his museum. He was a workaholic who would go home to have dinner with his wife and then sneak back into the office later in the evening. Newman, first of all, he had a reputation for his sense of humor. He was known for liking a good prank, which is going to be relevant in a minute. He also approached problems a lot more like a modern scientist. He taught himself statistics at a time before that was a common skill for biologists. You didn't actually have to know stats to be a zoologist at this point in time. But these two men seem to have realized that despite their differences, I think their approaches, they complemented each other very well, and they formed a working partnership that lasted until Lowry's death in the 1970s. So they wanted to do this project where they were going to recruit people from all over North America to do moon watching and create the first continent-wide snapshot of like migration patterns at the scale of the whole continent by getting a whole bunch of people to do this all at once. And you can do moon watching for a couple days on either side of the full moon. Now, there's no internet, basically no computers. There might have been a couple primitive computers in the US at the time, but these guys did not have access to them. So the way they did this was they spent literally up to 12 hours a day handwriting letters to potential volunteers all over the country, like writing to local Audubon chapters all over the continent, trying to recruit volunteers. They wrote these letters emphasizing what would be required of data collectors and the special contribution they would be making to science. They eventually recruited 2,500 volunteers in 325 locations from Canada down into Panama. And They wanted to make sure that the data that they got back was as high quality as possible, so they even took the step of printing a how-to pamphlet to mail out to all their volunteers, complete with some tips on how to stay comfortable during long stints of staring up at the sky. Now, I said Newman had a reputation for his sense of humor. This is an actual figure from one of their how-to pamphlets. I'm not kidding. I can't decide if this was supposed to be funny or if it was just the 50s. I don't know, the cigar's a nice touch. It's pretty great. Finally, in fall 1952, telescopes swung into action across North America. I'm going to take a sip of my water. I'm getting a bit hoarse. Isn't that great? All right, so now observations are flooding in. Paper data sheets are being mailed in from every corner of the continent, and they're stacking up higher and higher on Lowry and Newman's desks. And now they realize that they have another problem, which they should have thought about more ahead of time, which is how to analyze all of this data. Again, most biologists at this time did not have any training in statistics. They did not have access to computers to help them with this. They now needed to calculate the average direction and volume of bird migration at all of these hundreds of locations based on these data sheets. They wanted to look for connections with the weather, so they had to look up records on temperature and wind, et cetera, at each of these locations in printed books of weather records. And they had to depict all of this on easy-to-interpret maps, which they would have to draw by hand. It took them 14 years before they finally published this research. So finally, 1966, their magnum opus appeared in the ornithological journal, the Auk, which is one of the same ones that I would be working for about 50 years later. They titled it A Continent-Wide View of Bird Migration on 4 Nights in October. And it included page after page of these painstakingly crafted maps where they used arrows to indicate the direction and volume of bird migration at all these places. And I feel like today we're so used to seeing like satellite images of the Earth from space and what have you that it's almost hard to imagine how new this must have seemed at the time to be able to see these huge scale bird migration patterns laid out like this. Because you could see how birds were migrating in front of advancing cold fronts, things like this that we sort of take for granted today. This paper was 40 pages long, which is very long for a scientific paper. It was a blockbuster. It influenced studies of migration for years to come. It was also the last moon-watching paper that Lowry and Newman would ever publish together, because all of this hard work was about to be made mostly obsolete by the rise of a new technology that's actually going to be developed by one of their grad students, and that was radar. So I'm sure some of you have seen images like this before. This was taken from the nationwide weather radar system. So this is the same one where if you turn on the Weather Channel, you see the map showing where there's rain and stuff. And you can see some rain. That's rain, those green streaks going down the East Coast. But you guys know what those round blobs down the middle of the continent are, right? Someone say it. No, those are migrating birds. Yes, exactly. So there's always a few people who are not familiar with this. So all of those round blobs that you see especially down the middle of the continent, those are migrating birds. Birds show up really well on radar. And during migration season, in the evening, when they all lift off for their night of flying, there are so many of them that they can saturate the field of view of each individual radar station. So each of those circles is the field of view of one radar station that's filled with birds. So yeah, generally they filter migrating birds and other distractions out of the radar images that they use for TV weather reports, but birds show up really well on radar. But when radar first really came into widespread use, the people using it were not looking for birds. They were not looking for rainstorms either. Does anyone know when we first started using radar? You can say it. Yes, World War II. They were looking for Nazi planes. So I'm going to get a tiny bit technical just for a few seconds. Radar stands for radio detection and ranging. And the way that it works, if you're familiar with like sonar or echolocation, it's like that, but with radio waves instead of sound waves. So you're sending out radio waves. They're bouncing off of whatever stuff is out there. They're being reflected back. And from the energy that's reflected back, you can tell something about the size and distance of any objects out there. Scientists had worked all of this out by the 1930s, and so by the time World War II really got going, Great Britain had built a network of radar stations along their coast as an early warning system for any planes coming in from the mainland. But the European mainland, obviously. But pretty much as soon as these radar stations were operational, they started picking up some weird signals that they couldn't really figure out. So planes, as seen on these radar stations, they sort of plod along at a consistent speed and trajectory, but they were seeing these weird blips that like appeared and disappeared and darted around, changed direction at random. Supposedly at one point, like a red alert was sounded and British fighter planes were ordered into the air to intercept these strange signals over the English Channel when there wasn't anything there when they got up into the sky. So the exasperated radar operators started calling these mysterious signals radar angels. And I can see a couple of you can see where this is going. So while all this was happening, this guy, whose name was David Lack, had been teaching science at a secondary school in Devonshire in southwestern England. And he didn't know it yet, but he was about to become the father of radar ornithology. And again, David Lack was a young man at the point in time that we're going to be talking about, but he didn't sit for fancy portraits until he was famous later. So use your imagination. Lack, although he was basically a high school science teacher at this time, Lack had a background in ornithology. He had studied ornithology at Cambridge. In 1938, he took a year off from his teaching job to travel to the Galapagos Islands to do a study of Darwin's finches there. He got back to the UK just as World War II was heating up. And, Lack later wrote a short memoir about the early years of his career. So I want to read to you David Lack's own description of what happened when he arrived back in England at the beginning of the war. I had become a pacifist at the age of 17, so he'd signed a pledge to an anti-war organization. And in the autumn of 1940, I decided that I ought to leave my job at the school and work with a pacifist unit. I spent a trial night in the East End of London during heavy raids, but was so put off by the pacifists' earnest attitudes and so excited by the flashes and bangs that I was immediately converted from pacifism. A month later, the Central Register for Scientific Workers sent me to interview for an unspecified job. So he's joining the war effort, but they want to give him a special science job because he has a science background. As a biologist, you will of course have learned a lot of physics, the interviewer said. I'm afraid not, I answered. Well, I expect your maths is of a high standard. I'm afraid not. Then, very doubtfully, I fear this job will often entail going out in the wet and cold in the dark. Would you mind that? Not at all. So I was taken on, and 10 days later set off from London with 19 other biologists on a mystery coach tour. So you see where this is going? They put him to work on radar systems, because apparently any science degree was good enough to get you put to work on radar at this point. He was first assigned to the Orkneys, which are a wet, windy, remote group of islands off the north end of Scotland. I think he was the only person happy to be posted there because the birding was really good. He got to spend all his off hours looking for puffins and stuff. But shortly after that, he was reintroduced to an old classmate of his from Cambridge named George Varley, our third and final George of the evening. Varley had been an entomologist before the war, so a bug guy, but now he'd fallen into the same line of work as Lack. And it was Varley who introduced Lack to the problem of the so-called angels plaguing the radar operators. Now, David Lack was an ornithologist by training. He was familiar with the behavior of birds in flight. So he heard the description of these things, and right away he was like, you guys, it's birds. No one believed him. So Lack and Varley decided that they were going to put their heads together and prove that this is what was going on. They got pretty creative. At one point, they convinced an officer to tie a dead gull to a balloon and send it up into the air next to a radar station just to prove that a bird body could create a radar signal. Finally, in September 1941, they managed to use a powerful telescope to confirm that the source of a signal being tracked offshore in real time was a flock of gannets, the seabird that you see here. And so as the war continued, they kept working on this. They kept collecting examples of radar observations that they believed represented birds and documenting that the behavior of the so-called angels was consistent with the behavior of birds in flight. And radar technology was advancing rapidly, so pretty soon they were picking up flocks of starlings and things like that. There were a lot of skeptics, so I have one more brief David Lack quote. At one meeting, he wrote, after the physicists had again gravely explained that clouds of ions must be responsible, Varley with equal gravity accepted their view, providing that the ions were wrapped in feathers. This man was snarky. I really enjoyed getting to know him through his writing, because wow. So they stuck with it, and finally in 1945, as the end of the war neared, they got permission to publish their previously top secret findings in the journal Nature. Today, David Lack, who died in the 1970s, is better remembered for his work with Darwin's finches and with evolutionary ecology. I've heard him referred to as the father of evolutionary ecology. But this publication essentially kicked off the whole subdiscipline that's now known as radar ornithology. And radar ornithology might have been a footnote in my book instead of a whole chapter, if not for the fact that, of course, after the war, meteorologists started developing radar technology as a way to provide early warnings about hurricanes and major storms. Large flocks of birds show up just as well on weather radar as they had on military radar, so building a nationwide network of radar stations was great news for ornithologists interested in large-scale migration patterns. And this continues to be a really important source of data for looking at these large-scale migration patterns today. And so I have just one study that I'm going to talk about as an example. This is a paper that was published in 2018. Two scientists from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology downloaded radar scans covering every evening for 23 years. So this was 150,000 individual radar scans of the continents. And they analyzed them to see how weather factors like temperature and wind and air pressure predicted the appearance of big migration movements on radar. Because, you know, migration season lasts for weeks, but it's not like there's an equal number of birds in the sky every night. There's big nights and quiet nights, so they wanted to figure out why some nights are busy and some are not. If you've been paying attention, this is basically also what Lowry and Newman were trying to do with moon watching, but now we have huge data sets and we have computers to analyze them. So they found that their math explained almost 80% of the variation in migration intensity from one night to the next, and that using this method, they could even predict when big migratory movements would happen several days in advance. So if any of you have ever used Birdcast, which is this amazing tool put out by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, this is the technology that it's based on. That paper was the basis for what became Birdcast. And it is all thanks to a witty science teacher from Devonshire who figured out what was really going on with those mysterious so-called angels plaguing the radar operators guarding England from the Nazis. But of course, radar is not the only way to put radio waves to work tracking birds. And this brings me to my third, final, favorite migration innovator of the evening. I promised you an engineer, so this is the engineer. This guy's name is Bill Cochran. I do actually have a photo of young Bill Cochran. It's a miracle. So young Bill Cochran on the left, older Bill Cochran on the right. In the mid-1950s, Bill Cochran was a young Navy veteran working part-time toward an electrical engineering degree while also working for a brand new television station based in Champaign, Illinois. One morning, he went out to check on his employer's transmitter tower on the outskirts of town, and there was a guy there picking up dead birds off the ground. Cochran was intrigued, asked the guy what he was doing there and why he was interested in these dead birds. Turned out that this man's name was Richard Graber. He was an ornithologist from the University of Illinois. And specifically, he was there because he was studying tower kills, which is this phenomenon where flocks of birds fly into communications towers and are killed by the impact. Cochran was really intrigued by this and struck up a friendship with Graber. And pretty soon, Cochran was spending all of his spare time kind of tinkering together gadgets that might help Graber in his work. And so Bill Cochran appears in more chapters of my book than any other one person. The first project that Cochran and the ornithologist Bill Graber were, Bill, where did that come from? Richard Graber, wow, brain, sorry, Richard Graber, worked on together was, if you're familiar with nocturnal flight calls, which are these night migrating songbirds, they make unique calls when they're flying at night that they don't make at other times. And so these two men were the first to actually make recordings of those nocturnal flight calls. And they wanted to be able to record a whole 8-hour night of birds passing overhead. So one of my favorite anecdotes in my whole book is Bill Cochran, the engineering student, figuring out how to rig up a tape recorder with bicycle axles to hold these 6,000 feet of tape that they would need to record for 8 hours, because this was in the pre-digital era. But the chapter in my book where Bill Cochran looms the largest by far is the one on radio telemetry. So telemetry just means transmitting data from one place to another in real time. And there were a couple inventions right around this time that really kicked off the field of radio telemetry. The first one was the invention of the transistor in 1947. So this is a replica of the first transistor. To take a very technical topic and boil it down, before this, radios relied on vacuum tubes to amplify the signals that they were sending out. Vacuum tubes were bulky, breakable, not that reliable. Transistors provided a lightweight, efficient, durable way of doing the same thing. And they meant that suddenly radios could be adapted for all sorts of sensitive tasks that they wouldn't have been suited for before. So one of the first groups to jump on this and start experimenting with radio telemetry was the US Navy. And so they were trying things like using radio signals to transmit data on a jet pilot's vital signs to a doctor monitoring them from the ground in real time, or to test the effectiveness of cold water suits for sailors by transmitting out temperature data from inside the suit while it was being submerged in water. But it didn't take long for wildlife researchers to start borrowing some of these ideas. Really, my whole book is just a history of ornithologists being really good at borrowing scientific advances from other fields. So in 1957, some scientists in Antarctica used the system from the cold water suit tests to remotely monitor the temperature of a penguin egg during incubation. That's what's happening here. That's a penguin being manhandled in the lower right-hand corner. That same year, a group of researchers in Maryland borrowed some ideas from the Jet Pilot project and surgically implanted transmitters in woodchucks to try tracking their movements around a little nature preserve. Soon, big engineering firms like Honeywell were getting in on this, and they were trying to design radio tracking systems that they could then sell to wildlife biologists for a profit that biologists could use to track animals' movements in the wild. But they were doing things like putting a bunch of radio components in a metal box and then strapping this metal box onto the back of a grouse and sending the grouse off into the bushes. And a grouse with a metal box attached to its back is not going to last very long. So before wildlife telemetry could really take off, someone was going to have to think outside the box. You should have seen that one coming. Pause for laughter. And that someone was going to turn out to be Bill Cochran. So I think I said two technological advances. The first one was the invention of the transistor. The other thing that really kicked all of this off was Sputnik. So this is Sputnik 1, so illustration of it, launched in 1957. This was, of course, the first artificial satellite launched by the Soviets. Basically, all it did was circle the Earth and beep. Like, all it did was beep on a radio frequency. But if you had a radio receiver and you knew what you were doing, you could hear that beep from space from anywhere on Earth, and this touched off a whole new wave of interest in radios and what we could do with them. So by 1960, this is how we get back to Bill Cochran. By 1960, Bill Cochran, who still had not finished that electrical engineering degree, but was apparently sort of a transistor savant, if you will, had picked up more part-time work helping a University of Illinois radio astronomer build radio beacons that were going to be sent up on some of the first US satellites being launched in response to Sputnik. Cochran was also still doing work with Graeber, the ornithologist, and his colleagues over at the Illinois Natural History Survey. And it didn't take too long before someone suggested combining Cochran's two part-time jobs. Like, hey, Bill, what do you think would happen if we put one of your radio gadgets on a duck? I don't know, sounds fun, let's try it. So they caught a duck at the field station over on the Illinois River, and they sent it over to the satellite lab. And they strapped the transmitter onto this bird using a metal band that went over its chest. And no, it's okay, listen to where the story goes. They hadn't planned this, but it turned out that the bird's breathing just distorted the band in a way that affected the radio signal. And so when they released this duck, without even meaning to, they realized that they were accidentally collecting, they could track its respiratory rate in flight. And so they had accidentally collected the first data on the physiology of a bird in flight without meaning to. They all got a nice little publication in a scientific journal out of this, so fantastic. And the moment that this duck took flight wearing a radio transmitter that he had built. I mean, goodness only knows what was going on in Bill Cochran's brain, but he was hooked. And he knew that that is what he wanted to devote his life to. And he spent all of the decades to come building radio transmitters for animals. And so we're talking about birds, but we're also all familiar with like radio collars for wolves and deer. This really all goes back to Bill Cochran. He was the first person to make wildlife telemetry feasible. Building a radio transmitter that's going to be worn by a wild animal requires making trade-offs among a long list of factors, because a longer antenna will give you a stronger signal, a bigger battery will give you a longer lasting device, but they both add weight. You don't want to make it too heavy. Bill Cochran, who still would not officially finish that electrical engineering degree for several more years. I think eventually the University of Illinois told him they could not continue employing him until he finished his last 2 credits or whatever. He turned out to be really good at getting this balance just right. He favored designs that were as small and simple and compact as possible, and instead of putting everything in a metal box, he figured out how to just dip all his components into plastic resin to seal them together and waterproof them. He started out working with biologists who were trying to survey the local cottontail rabbit population, things like that. But it didn't take long enough until he was building transmitters small enough that they could be placed on fairly large, chunky songbirds. This was good news for Cochran's old friend and mentor, the ornithologist Richard Graeber, because he studied thrushes, which are relatively large songbirds, you know, as compared to a warbler or something. And he wanted to learn more about their migratory behavior. But these devices only had a range of a few miles. So if you wanted to use one to follow a migrating bird, you literally had to follow a migrating bird. Yes. So in 1965, Richard Graeber found a pilot who was willing to try following a migrating radio-tagged thrush at night in a small plane. And so May 1965, they captured a gray-cheeked thrush outside Urbana, Illinois, and they trimmed a small patch of feathers off of its back, and they stuck on a tiny radio transmitter using eyelash glue, the same stuff that you would use to attach false eyelashes to your face, which is still used for this sort of thing sometimes because it's non-toxic and it doesn't irritate the skin and it wears off after its own on a while. So this is a total digression, but I have this mental image of generations of like crusty macho wildlife biologists having to learn exactly where the eyelash glue is kept at the local cosmetic store. Anyway, forgive me. That night, they waited for the bird to take off, and they took off in the plane and managed to pick up the signal. And Graeber and the pilot followed this bird north for 400 miles before turning back, 200 of which were over the open water of Lake Michigan. They couldn't see the bird. They were just sitting in the cockpit listening to this like wavering beep, beep, beep through the night. Graeber, the ornithologist, was so awed by this experience and by imagining what this small bird was accomplishing that when he wrote about this for Audubon magazine later, he compared it to how he felt watching the television coverage of the Apollo moon missions. And Bill Cochran, the engineer, was just getting started. Yes. 1973, Cochran and a student named Charles Welling tagged another thrush. Sorry, got my microphone cord with my thumb there. They tagged another thrush passing through Illinois in the spring. And this time, they spent a full week following this bird almost 1,000 miles, all the way up across the Canadian border and into Manitoba in a station wagon with a hole cut in the top for their radio receiver. Cochran later wrote this up in a very dry 2-page scientific paper, and I'm just reading this paper and going, they did what? Like, so they had some adventures along the way, which did not make it into the scientific paper. At one point, Welling, the student who was along to help drive, basically spent a night in jail when they were pulled over by a suspicious police officer in rural Minnesota, because who wouldn't be suspicious seeing that thing drive through your small Minnesota town in the middle of the night? Because remember, this is a night migrating bird. Cochran didn't want to stop for too long for fear of losing the signal and never finding this bird again. So he basically kicked Welling out of the car to sort it out as best he could, kept on driving until the bird set down at dawn, where he was pretty sure he'd be able to find it again later, doubled back, bailed him out, and on they went. According to Cochrane, at another point, they both caught like a stomach flu and couldn't find a doctor who would see them on no notice in the middle of nowhere, so just sort of sweated it out and kept on driving. The only reason they gave up after they crossed into Canada was because the car's engine gave out on them. So they were like pouring ditch water into whatever part of a car engine you pour water into to try to keep it going, and finally had to give up. I'm showing off my lack of mechanical knowledge, sorry. So because they were able to stick with this one bird over such a long distance, they were gathering data on its airspeed, its ground speed, how much distance it covered each night, the precise direction that it set out in each evening. And because they were able to stick with this bird over such a long distance, they were able to track how the precise direction that the bird set out in each night changed as its position changed relative to magnetic north. So this project actually provided some of the first real-world evidence that songbirds use some sort of internal magnetic compass as one of their tools for migration. We're still figuring out the biology behind that, by the way. It's still a little bit of a mystery how they do this. We just know that they do it. So I could go on and on. I've given this talk for ornithologists, and every single time there's someone in the audience who knew Bill Cochran and has more Bill Cochran stories. This man had many amazing adventures over the course of his life. He never really got the hang of the politics of academia or of the peer review system for scientific publishing. Remember, he was an engineer by training, not a biologist. I also gather that he was maybe not the easiest person to get along with on a personal level. I think he was kind of like a crotchety guy. He was married 3 times, for one thing. And so he always remained a bit of an outsider. And by the late 90s, he had left his job with the Illinois Natural History Survey on what I gather were maybe not the most positive terms. But he kept building radio systems for ornithologists in his garage into the beginning of this century. Like he was still at it. I had the great good fortune to speak to Bill multiple times while I was working on my book, and even to visit him at his home in Illinois, where this station wagon was still in the driveway. The antenna was gone off the top by the time I got there, but it was clearly this same vehicle. And most of his backyard was taken up with an enormous radio receiver tower. He was also a ham radio enthusiast, which should not surprise anyone if anyone's familiar with hams. My husband's a ham. It's a whole thing. So he was a hilarious character. He loved to screen his calls by pretending to be a janitor at an animal shelter. So I would call him at a prearranged time for a phone interview, and he'd pick up the phone and go, "Hello, animal shelter, we're closed." And I'd just be like, "Bill, is that you?" So sadly, Bill passed away in 2022 at the age of 90. And I really believe that he is an unsung hero of 20th century science. And I'm really glad that my book is hopefully bringing some of his many exploits to more people, because he just did so much cool stuff. So I'm coming to the end of my talk. I've been talking and talking and talking, I'm sorry. In my last few minutes, like I said, I'm gonna talk just a little bit about why this is all relevant today for bird conservation. I did wanna mention briefly though, I'm aware that all 3 of the people that I have been talking about are dead white guys, to be blunt. I promise that the book is not all dead white guys, but when I was working on my talk, I knew I was gonna be giving this talk for some audiences of ornithologists, and I didn't want to be talking about someone who might be sitting in the audience. That seemed a little too weird. So this seemed the safest approach for the book talk. And I promise that if you get to read the book, there's all sorts of people in the book. And in addition to talking about these older technologies, I also talk about the latest, miniaturized satellite transmitters and high volume genomic sequencing and machine learning tools for analyzing giant data sets, things like that. And so thanks to all of these recent high-tech advances, today we have a clearer, more detailed picture of bird migration than we ever have before. That sort of data can help us target conservation efforts effectively, and that's a good thing because migratory birds are not doing so great. So this is a paper that was published in 2019. Some of you might be familiar with it because it generated a lot of media coverage when it came out. This was nicknamed the 3 billion birds paper. Because what this project was is a big group of ornithologists got together and drew on a whole bunch of different data sources and came up with an estimate that there are about 2.9 billion, with a B, fewer breeding birds in North America now than there were in 1970. So that's staggering. Researchers and wildlife managers have been scrambling to figure out how to stop the bleeding. And so when it came time to write a concluding chapter for my book and to try to tie a bow on all of this somehow, I wanted to tackle the question of whether some of these new migration tracking technologies might be at least part of the answer, and also just whether there's any reason at all to feel hopeful when we're confronted with numbers like this. So I talked to two of the leading experts on migratory bird conservation in North America today. I talked to Pete Mara, who's one of the senior authors of this paper. He formerly was the director of the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Institute, and now he's at Georgetown University. And he's helping lead the Road to Recovery initiative that's grown out of this paper. I also talked to Jill Deppy, who's the head of the Audubon Society's migratory bird program. And they were both very kind to give me a few minutes out of their busy day to let me ask them like laughably broad questions, like what is the state of migratory bird conservation today? And also if they feel hopeful about the future. And they both had strikingly similar things to say. They both agreed that despite all the ever more detailed migration research that's happening now, we still need more data to understand what's behind the declines of many of these species. Because every species is different, has different migratory routes, different needs. So you might think that like we should just stop spending money on research and shift all of our funding to conservation, but we don't actually know enough yet to do effective conservation for a lot of these species. They agreed that there's a need to get better at consolidating the data that is being collected and get it into the hands of people who can use it, policymakers, conservation activists. They agreed that we need to get better at working across international borders. We need to incorporate more partners from the social sciences and more perspectives from indigenous communities. And somewhat to my surprise, they both insisted that yes, they think there is reason for hope. And so I'm going to conclude by reading to you what Pete Mara said when I asked him if he feels optimistic about the future when he gets up and goes to work in the morning after I take a drink of water, losing my voice a bit. So Pete Mara said, I'm very optimistic. We've done this in the past, we've corrected other environmental issues, and now we have to deal with climate change. So while it seems like there's this overwhelming deluge of negative issues and challenges with getting people on board with these things and constant pressures on nature, I choose to be optimistic and hopeful just because I don't see any benefit of being pessimistic or having a lack of hope. I just don't choose to take that route. Don't get me wrong, there are times when I might be negative or spiraling down into a pit of agony, but I'm not going to do that. So I thought those were wise words. I don't know about all of you, but when I find myself spiraling down into a pit of agony, I usually just go birding. Thank you. So the number one question I get asked is, are you working on a second book? I'm not right now. I've also been asked quite a bit already today, if I'm like, are you an academic? Are you a teacher? I'm currently just a full-time freelance bird writer. Like I write about ornithology for a variety of publications. So this is my website, RebeccaHeisman.com. You can sign up for it on my website. I have a monthly email newsletter that I just send out once a month with what I've been writing, interesting things that I've read other places, book recommendations. So if you're interested in birds and bird science and you want like a really easy way to support my work, you could go to my website and sign up for that monthly email. It's just once a month, I promise. And yeah, thank you so much to the Leavenworth Bird Festival for having me. This has been really fun. And we've got the book for sale back there. And I would also love to take any questions that anyone might have. Yes?
Have you tried moon spotting yourself?
Yeah, have I tried moon watching myself? Yes. I did borrow a telescope and try it. I learned very quickly why all the tips for staying comfortable were necessary, because I was using the kind of telescope that you have to kind of lean over like that, which gets to be kind of uncomfortable real fast when you're trying to do it for like 45 minutes. Also, the full moon is really bright through a telescope, so like you get a headache pretty quickly. I did it for a while, and I saw one thing that I thought maybe might have been a bird, but I wasn't real sure. It might have been just a quiet night where I was for migration. I should have checked Birdcast before doing it, and I did not. So the answer is I have tried it. It didn't go super well. There are people who are trying to bring it back, though, by like automating it with video cameras. So there was actually a paper just published in January that used like a modern version of moon watching to study social behavior in these night migrating birds by seeing how often they saw birds in groups versus by themselves passing in front of the moon. So there are folks trying to bring it back, which I think is really cool.
The question is, were you smoking a cigar while you were?
I was not, no. Maybe that would have helped. Yes.
I've got two questions.
Okay.
The man that's holding the skin,
Yes.
is that an ivory-billed woodpecker?
I think I'm not sure. I've been asked about that a few times. I can go back to that picture. I think it might be.
Yeah.
And the reason I think it might be is this. The other thing that George Lowry is famous for is championing some really questionable ivory-billed woodpecker sightings in like the 70s. So that's the other thing that some people know him for, is being an ivory-billed woodpecker evangelist.
And then does eBird assist in migration patterns?
Yes, so the last chapter in my book is all about citizen science or community science. And so yes, there is really cool research being done all the time now on migration patterns using eBird data. So if you are an eBirder and you're submitting complete eBird checklists, you are contributing to migration research, absolutely.
Is artificial intelligence changing how you study bird migration?
Oh, that's a great question. I've been asked that one a lot lately. I am very far from an artificial intelligence expert. So let me preface this with that. Here's my limited understanding. All the stuff that's been in the news the last couple of years is like generative AI, which is getting AI to like create something new, like a new piece of text or a picture, supposedly create something new. As a writer, I could go off on a rant about this, but I won't. To the best of my knowledge, there's not really any applications of that for bird research, and I can't even think of what applications there would be. And I wrote the book before ChatGPT hit the news. I do in the book talk about machine learning, which is sort of the previous generation of artificial intelligence, and that is being used to analyze big data sets for like, 150,000 radar images, or it's being used for nocturnal flight call research to like pick out and identify the calls in 8 hours of recordings so that someone doesn't have to sit there and listen to 8 hours of recordings. So yes and no, if that makes sense. But I'm not an AI expert, so I don't know. Anything else?
I have one
Yes.
question. So from your reading, it always bothers me to know something about it. It seems the ability of bird to migrate, to find a route, is born with it. It's not taught.
That's a great question.
You repeat it.
Yeah, the question was basically, are birds born knowing how to migrate, or do they learn, right? So this is getting a little bit outside what I wrote about in the book. So I'm not an expert, but as I understand it, the answer is it depends. Something like a warbler that only lives a few years and it doesn't really migrate in flocks. Most people who study warblers would tell you that warblers, it's instinctive, like it's genetic, it's innate. They found genes that seem to be related to migratory behavior, so it's hardwired. In something like a shorebird, because there are also shorebirds that migrate long distances, they live longer and they live in flocks. And so in a bird like that, more of that migratory behavior might be learned. And so I just last summer wrote a short article about a new piece of research that came out in Europe, where some researchers took godwits that had been godwit eggs out of nests in Poland, and took the eggs out of the nests and reared them in captivity until they were a certain age, and then they released half the chicks back into Poland in the flock that they had been born into, and then they trucked the other half of the chicks into Hungary and released them into a different population of the same species that had different migratory behavior to see whether the chicks that they moved to Hungary would migrate like the Polish birds or like the Hungarian birds, and they migrated like Hungarian birds. So they seemed to learn their migratory route from the other birds that they were with. So this is still an active area of research, is I guess where I'm going with this. People are still studying this. Does that answer your question, sort of?
It's sort of strange because I read a lot about the Western sandpiper. All the adults left. Only thing left is the juveniles, then years. They migrated in a flock together because nobody led them or taught them.
Yeah, I don't know a lot about that specifically, but yeah, it's a great question and something that a lot of people are still trying to figure out, I guess, is the answer.
Thank you.
Yeah. Is there anything else? Okay, well, thank you, and I'll be here signing books, so thank you. Thank you.
Everybody for being here. If you are participating in an event tomorrow, I hope you have fun. Thank you for being here for part of BirdFest, and hope you have a good rest of your weekend. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.